So a very good morning or good afternoon, good evening, wherever the audience may find itself. But presumably to most of you, still good morning and welcome to this webinar co-organized by the European Policy Center and the Egmont Institute. My name is Alexander Mattelaar. I'll have the pleasure to act as today's Master of Ceremony. So I'll, of course, first welcome you all most warmly to today's discussion, in which the aspiration is to talk Brexit, but also beyond Brexit. What has the future in store for EU-UK relations? And by way of quick introduction, I'll perhaps just add that when we were started planning this webinar, the EU-UK relationship was still more or less a dossier that was treated on the back burner. It was not really in the limelight. There were some rumblings in the background, but it was not sort of on top of the policy agenda at that point in time. Today, that is really no longer the case. We have the heated debate that has intensified in recent days on the potential triggering on Article 16, the ongoing conundrum with respect to the protocol on Northern Ireland. But nonetheless, our ambition, our intention is to stick what we had originally in mind, namely that is to take a step back and move beyond the debate as it is conducted in the newspaper headlines, and take a 360-degree point of view on the state of play of the relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union, and in particular also what to expect with respect to the medium-term future and further outlook. And I'm absolutely delighted that to that purpose, I'm joined by a most distinguished set of speakers. Most of them do not require any introduction at all, but just for good measure, we're happy to have Jonathan Fall on the panel, who's the chair of European Public Affairs at the Brunswick Group, also a senior associate fellow at Egmont. We have also Fabian Zule, chief executive and chief economist of the European Policy Center. There's Georgina Wright, who's a senior fellow and director of the Europe program at the Institut Montaigne. And last but not least, there is Timon Salomonsen, who is currently the head of the UK division at the European External Action Service. And before joining the EEAS, he served as the Brexit delegate in the Belgian Perm Rep to the European Union. So really a wealth of expertise in the virtual room. And we have agreed amongst us that we'll play this as in a 2x2 format. So I'll first give the floor to Sir Jonathan and Fabian to give short impulse statements on the state of play in the Brexit debate today. And then I'll ask Georgina and Timon to provide brief responses and comments to what was said. And then in the second stage, we turn the table around. Georgina and Timon will share their thoughts on what the future outlook will look like. And Sir Jonathan and Fabian can then respond in discussion mode. Last but not least, there's also a very knowledgeable audience in the virtual room. So by all means, we also count on you, dear ladies and gentlemen, to pitch in with comments, thoughts, and questions. You can do so by making good use of the chat box en cours de route. I think there is probably also the option of raising your virtual hand and ask for the floor, that we can also then turn to that stage when we reach the Q&A. That by way of short introduction. I'll leave it at that and immediately pass on the floor to Jonathan and Fabian for their opening thoughts. Over to you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Alexander, and hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss these important issues in such distinguished company. We're talking about two unions very close to my heart. And I have to start, I think, by saying that I think we are in a dangerous situation. Things are not looking good. But perhaps I will start by looking backwards a little bit to how we got to where we are and what lessons we can draw from that. Northern Ireland is 100 years old this year. It was created in 1921 when Ireland took its first steps towards full independence. And it has been through quite an extraordinary history in those 100 years. But what it has never been is a neighbor of a member state of the European Union without being one itself, obviously. Ireland joined the EU at the same time as the UK in 1973. The notion that England is an island, or even the United Kingdom is an island, is of course nonsense, even though such illustrious people as Shakespeare claimed that it was. There is a land border between the UK and another country, and that is Ireland, and that is a member state of the European Union. So it was clear from the very beginning of the Brexit saga, so at least from 2015, when the Conservative Party won an election in the UK and had promised a referendum on membership, it was clear that this would be an issue. The Northern Ireland border had been a peaceful one, it had been a militarized one, it had been a dangerous one, but it had never been a border between the EU and a third country. Frankly, although they were very clearly warned by myself, among many others, the issue as to what would happen at the border didn't play a very significant role in the pre-referendum discussions, and frankly, not much outside Northern Ireland in the referendum campaign itself. Lots of breezy references to technology will sort it out, we'll deal with it when the time comes were made. That was frankly irresponsible, was known to be irresponsible at the time. But it wasn't until the actual withdrawal negotiations began in earnest that people had to address seriously the issue of the Northern Ireland border with Ireland. Now, there is no perfect, logical, neat solution. We are in the realm of squaring circles. Why? Because the very governance of Northern Ireland itself is a combination of British sovereignty and cooperation with Ireland, the Republic. That is all enshrined in the Good Friday Agreement, which brought peace which has been sustained until today, and we must all hope that it continues to be sustained to Northern Ireland. And the governance of Northern Ireland, Belgians, I think, will not be surprised by the intricacy, but many other Europeans, let alone people in the rest of the world might be, is a very complicated constitutional structure with East-West, London, Belfast dimensions, and of course, British sovereignty over Northern Ireland. It's part of the United Kingdom, and a significant north-south Ireland, Northern Ireland, all island Ireland dimension as well. That was the case long before Brexit was dreamt of, and when you introduce Brexit and EU membership into the equation, you have to understand that if you bring Ireland into the picture, you bring the EU into the picture, because Ireland wasn't going to leave the European Union, didn't have a referendum, hasn't left the European Union, is a member state to this day. So it was going to be complicated to maintain the North-South all-island dimension with a United Kingdom no longer a member of the European Union. And so it has proved. It has proved difficult. I won't go through the history of the protocol as initially negotiated by Theresa May's government, ultimately negotiated and concluded by Boris Johnson's government. But it is what it is. It is where it stands today. It is clearly unpopular in the unionist community in Northern Ireland, and has become a matter of great political controversy again in the arena of British politics. What is controversial? Well, what we have seen in recent weeks, and I really mean recent weeks, is a very rapid slide from concern about the details of trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the sausages and so on, to the role of the Court of Justice in the governance of the protocol and the withdrawal arrangements, trade and cooperation agreement generally in Northern Ireland, to the ultimate fundamental issue of whether EU rules should apply in Northern Ireland at all. Now, that is a thoroughgoing questioning of the protocol itself. The protocol, I think it's uncontroversial to say, is one of the fundamental pillars of the whole Brexit settlement. It is what made the withdrawal agreement possible and ultimately what made the trade and cooperation agreement possible. It was endorsed by the British political institutions in the normal way, and it was at least partly the subject of a general election in 2019, which endorsed, by giving the Conservative Party a large majority, which endorsed the deal that Mr. Johnson had made. So if one of the problems in the era between 2015 and 2019 was there was no settled consensus view in the UK of what it wanted from the relationship with the EU, and Brussels, reasonably enough, kept asking the question, what do you want? And successive governments found it hard to answer. There is today a settled view. The British political constitutional system has delivered in the way it's supposed to, a majority government in the House of Commons, which has endorsed a series of agreements. Now, those agreements, the protocol among them, contain safeguard clauses, which brings me, and I will stop after this because I'm sure we will talk a lot about this later, to the question of Article 16 and the possible invocation of it, which we are told is under active consideration in London, and as we're told, has also led to active consideration in the Brussels system of how the European Union would react. Now, Article 16 is an intricate, complex provision, which, if invoked, would lead to a whole series of further discussions and consideration of the scope of possible measures taken on either side. I won't read it out to you. Everybody can read it. It's a typical piece of Brussels influence international legal language. Every word counts. Everything has to be proportionate. And at best, I think, if Article 16 we're going to have, will lead to another more or less protracted period of consultation, discussion, controversy, an attritional set of exchanges. At worst, of course, and we may hear later about how bad things can get, it could lead to widespread acrimony, trade restrictions, retaliations, and a rather considerable deterioration of cross-channel relations. I hope very much that that will not be the case, but it is hard as we sit here today to be very optimistic.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive state of play with respect to the Northern Ireland questions, Jonathan. Fabian, what do things look like from where you sit?
Yes, thanks very much for inviting me. Unfortunately, and many of you who've heard me before, the situation doesn't look very good, and that is very much an understatement. In some senses, what we have is a tragedy foretold. Some of the things which are happening now we're warned about. There were a number of difficulties which were going to emerge in this relationship. But some of that also has to do with politics, in particular politics on the other side of the channel, but we will get into that a bit more. And from that perspective, I don't think things will get better, and I will explain what I mean by that. But let's start with the first tragedy foretold, which tends to be a little bit underplayed, also because that is in the interest of the UK government. But the reality is that the economic relationship has already taken a severe battering. We have already seen that a process of economic disintegration leads to very significant economic costs. That is in static terms, in terms of how trade has shifted. But what we have also increasingly seen now is in dynamic terms, in supply chains, and particularly in the movement of people, where, again, it was warned before the hard Brexit deal was agreed that the UK is exceptionally dependent on foreign workers, particularly EU workers. And this is playing out in many different sectors in the UK now. We have also seen that for particular sectors, exporting has become virtually impossible given the timeframes involved, given the costs involved. And all of this in a situation where we have slower than usual exchanges in any case because of COVID, where we already have a non-application of some of the checks controls on the UK side. So in actual terms, what we can expect in the economic relationship is that it gets worse over time as well. And that also plays into Northern Ireland. And I think part of the problem which we are facing now, and I'm not suggesting in any way that Northern Ireland is only an economic problem. It is far more complex than that, as Jonathan has talked about. But part of the problem which we are facing there is that we have two incompatible outcomes. You are either part of the single market, or you are fully integrated into a UK which seems to be very much concerned about diverging from the single market. But you cannot diverge from the single market and be in the single market at the same time. And that is going to be a major issue which we are going to have to face. Where we're at in terms of politics, I think one of the features which we have seen throughout the Brexit negotiations and into the first phase of the new relationship has been a distinctive difference between the technical side and the political side. I think on the technical side, there continues to be a good exchange. There continue to be a number of areas where progress is being made, sometimes more slowly than you would desire, but overall, I think that process is at least starting to go in the right direction. But of course, the politics feeds into that. And for certain areas, no progress is being made because the political masters do not want progress to be made. And I'm here talking about London. And that is also starting to further erode trust and patience on the EU side. And I think this is one of the fundamental changes in a way we have seen that over this whole process, both trust and patience has gone down, and it has now reached levels where it is very difficult to make any progress because governments no longer believe in anything which is being said. And that means that it's very hard to do anything on trust. And you're back into very acrimonious discussions around how do you check that things actually happen. And I think on the EU side, the majority, if not everyone, has concluded that the UK is consistently acting in bad faith. So this is the backdrop to the difficulties we have in Northern Ireland. And I'm not going to go through that. Jonathan explained that very well. Just to say, I think from my perspective, we have seen the Commission proposals to try to ease some of the real difficulties which are there. And I think these are genuine proposals which will help to address some of the practical difficulties. But it doesn't seem to be what the UK government is actually interested in. So it is much more, it seems, about the notions of sovereignty, the notions of not cooperating with the EU wherever possible. So I'm not sure these proposals will go anywhere, not because they're bad proposals, but simply because I don't see the receptiveness on the UK side. What has also happened, and I think this is why we are at an even more precarious point now, is that things are changing in the capitals in the EU. I think in particular, we have seen a worsening of relationship with Paris. And I'm sure Georgina can go into that as well. Not being helped, of course, by an election campaign in France, where Brexit is not a major issue, but it certainly is an issue for a variety of different reasons we can go into more later on. That's not to say everything Paris is doing is because of the election, so I'm not trying to suggest that. But I think what has always been a feature of the Brexit debate is that in the UK, there seemed to be the impression that domestic politics only exists in one country. And domestic politics will feature into this. And my worry has always been that the UK hasn't really recognized that the Commission is its best friend in this process, that the Commission will continue to try to depoliticize, to de-dramatize the issue. My reading is that we have reached the end of the line where member states are now looking to come in if they are not satisfied with what is happening in the relationship, and that would escalate the situation significantly. And one escalation there would be Article 16 on the UK side, and whatever technical discussion we can have about the consequences of that. Firstly, I think there needs to be a recognition that there are formal responses, but there are also other responses to an Article 16. If you direct your customs official to work to rule, then that alone will have a major impact. So if, for example, we have a situation as we had just before the Brexit deal was struck, we will see a clogging up of ports within a day, no longer than that. So the consequences of Article 16 being triggered by the UK, I think, are far more immediate if the EU chooses to go down that line of a strong response. And my reading would be that now we are at the point when that would happen. So what is the red line for the EU? Well, I would say the red line for the EU pretty much has been reached. There is no renegotiation of the protocol. Yes, there can be ways of trying to make the implementation easier, but it is not a renegotiation. And I think what in the end has always been the red line is that the place of Ireland in the single market cannot be put under threat. And that will be under threat if we continue down this route. So in the end, there will be consequences if we go further down this confrontational approach by the UK government. Of course, there is the possibility that the UK government U-turns. It has done it before, and in the past, I was wrong in terms of thinking that they would stick to their guns. They didn't. But this time it's also different because of domestic politics in the UK. And I'll finish on that. I would just point to the current discussion around corruption in the UK, the opinion polls, which are starting to turn against the Conservatives. So I think the risk that the government will try to use this issue is very high. So I think we might well see an Article 16 and essentially a trade war as a consequence. I think that is a terrible thing, not only in its own right, but also in a situation where we should be working together to deal with some of the big issues which are on the table. I mean, COP26 is difficult enough without having this interference from the relationship, the global situation, the political situation. But if we are going down this route, undoubtedly it has political consequences. The relationship between the UK and the EU is not going to improve, certainly not in the medium term. And I'll just finish with a quote from a paper we did just after the TCA was concluded. I think this is unfortunately where we are now. So the quote is, "The prospect of a high friction political relationship raises questions about strengthening cooperation in areas of mutual interest, such as climate change, multilateralism, and global health. Both sides must invest in the relationship and rebuild trust to prevent any conflict from escalating, or else they risk the collapse of the deal and the return to a no-deal-like state." Unfortunately, I think we're very close to that.
Thank you very much, Fabian. I'm starting to fear that the pattern in this webinar is gloomy, gloomier, and gloomiest. So I do wonder whether the outlook for the future has brighter things to offer. Can I perhaps first inquire whether Georgina and Timon want to respond to some of the things that have already been said relating to current events before we then turn to the future? Are there any things that spring to mind as things that warrant elaboration, or is the sort of bleak perspective that Jonathan and Fabian have just outlined really the baseline scenario that is broadly accepted from your respective point of view? Georgina, go ahead.
Thank you, Alexander, and thank you to Egmont EPC for the invitation. I do really think this is an important conversation, and actually, you know, a lot of time when I talk to my colleagues across the EU, they're like, oh no, the UK, you know, problematic. But actually, I do think we need to be thinking about what's happening now, but also the future if we are to try and find a way forward. Very briefly, because I have 5 minutes after to kind of elaborate on the future. I mean, I completely agree basically with Jonathan Fabian in the sense that, you know, when the TCA landed, everyone knew that it was the end of negotiations, but it wasn't the end of talks. And that's because there were a number of things about adapting to the new trading reality, seeing how we could simplify perhaps or not some of the rules, especially for businesses in Northern Ireland, but also, you know, British businesses based in Great Britain exporting to the EU and vice versa. There are also a number of decisions that we have to come back to, you know, on energy, on fisheries in a couple of years' time. And frankly, I was always of the view that we needed a period of mourning before we could really start, you know, afresh and think creatively and constructively about the future relationship. But I think it's absolutely clear, and the British government's been absolutely, I mean, you know, I think Fabian's right, with new sort of, what was it, Jonathan? I can't remember. We have, you know, Johnson in power and Lord Frost. And when they, you know, when Johnson became Prime Minister, the sense was, well, there risks being a much tougher stance on the EU, but at least we'll know where the UK stands on things. And I think that that is true. That, you know, the talks were highly political, they were highly politicized, and it was clear that there was going to be a need for a time of a mourning period before we could think about the future. And the government, the UK government, has said, you know, Northern Ireland Protocol is absolutely key. And unless we can resolve this, it's going to be very difficult to talk about anything else. And I can come back to that maybe later. On the Franco-British relationship, because Fabian raised it, I mean, I think it's, you know, I say this to British colleagues all the time. Until, you know, the UK it's not really an issue in France. And that changed with AUKUS, and I'll come back to that. But in France, you know, you talk much more about, obviously, the EU, you talk about Germany, but you don't really talk about the UK. And actually, Brexit in the public debate, I mean, people had switched off from Brexit long before the negotiations were even over. And I actually think that it's not the fisheries issue so much, it's AUKUS that brought the attention back to the UK. And also, you know, AUKUS and Brexit and all of this is, you know, coming sort of part of one whole thing. And I think as France enters a presidential election, it's very difficult to see how the relationship, the bilateral relationship between the UK and France can significantly improve. And I think, you know, Brexit talks are bleeding into everything else. There is, I think, at the very beginning, a willingness on both sides to try and separate Brexit from their defence and security partnership. But I think both sides see the rhetoric from the Prime Minister, but also, you know, President at times and maybe some of his ministers as unhelpful. And also there's something you hear in Paris is the EU is a central pillar to Macron's domestic and foreign policy. So if the UK continues to have a confrontational relationship vis-a-vis the EU, that also makes it much harder to kind of engage as much as either side potentially would like. But I think the UK is also growing a little bit tired of what it sees as France's tough stance during the Brexit negotiations and some of the rhetoric it has had since the TCA has landed. And that is also inevitably bleeding into attitudes. So I don't think there will be any significant improvement before the election. I just don't see how that can be a priority for France. But I do think there is desperately a need for some sort of bilateral track, maybe at the technical level, you know, to take Fabian's example of technical talks between the UK and the EU actually advancing relatively well, perhaps slowly, but they're continuing regardless of the political level, highest political level. Well, maybe that's something we should think about with France and the UK as well.
Over to you, Timon.
Thank you very much, Alexander, and thank you for the invitation. I think the debate already shows how everything at this point in time hinges on how we solve the implementation of the protocol. As you can imagine, I have to carefully weigh my words, and I'll speak from a very personal point of view. So my words cannot be attributed to the institutions I work for. And I'll be a bit repetitive in my message as well. To start with what Sir Jonathan explained, I agree with a lot what he said. I think in Northern Ireland, we have a unique situation that was created by Brexit. As before, EU law actually underpinned the Good Friday Agreement. And with Brexit and the EU leaving the EU, we needed to find unique solutions to that unique situation. And obviously, one of them is to avoid a land border on the island of Ireland as a crucial part of the Good Friday Agreement, and I fully agree there. And this is what we did. I mean, we tried to find a solution from the beginning. We had a phased approach on purpose to make sure that the most important issues like the citizens' rights and the Northern Irish issue would be solved from the beginning with the withdrawal agreement. And to make sure that we do everything to guarantee the Good Friday Agreement. Now, when Sir Jonathan says that the protocol is clearly unpopular in unionist communities in Northern Ireland, and it's very controversial, I would respond to that our focus now should be on concrete problems on the ground that have to be solved for all communities in Northern Ireland, so everybody can see that is what we're focusing on, and that definitely is a focus of the EU. In terms of EU rules in Northern Ireland, I agree when you're part of the internal market, and there I agree also with Fabian Zulek. Well, you need to abide by the rules of what we have as a unique ecosystem of the internal market. We need to be able to protect the internal market. I mean, you cannot diverge from the single market and be in the single market at the same time, as Fabian Zulek explained, and I agree there. What we did is we tried to combine the EU internal market with the UK Customs Union for the Northern Ireland in the protocol, and it actually worked. We found a way, but of course it has to be implemented. On the safeguard clauses in Article 16, again, I'm repetitive, but at this point in time, it's too early to talk about that. Our focus is now on finding solutions. Our colleagues are sitting at the table with each other as we speak, so that's really what we are focused on at this point in time. A tragedy foretold, again, I think it's too early. I'm not optimistic at this point in time either, but we need to give it our very, very best. To say that the UK is consistently acting in bad faith, I wouldn't subscribe to that view, but just to simply say that we really, really want the UK to engage in finding these solutions. On the worsening of the relationship with Paris not being helped by an election campaign, within the EU, of course, unity is key. And what I've seen over the years that I've been following these negotiations or being part of it, is that we kept that unity. And even with the specific bilateral issues that are going on, you can see in the council discussions that for now that unity is really holding. So it's true that the Commission will continue and is trying to depoliticize and de-dramatize. That's absolutely true, because we don't want to dramatize things. We want to find solutions, concrete solutions. And part of that is not renegotiating the protocol. We agree to it, and let's stick to it and work within that framework. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Timon. It seems that the idea to not let things get out of hand is quite prevalent. If we sort of turn our attention to the future, the medium-term and long-term outlook, perhaps that also offers ways to sort of think about more constructive engagement. Georgina, would you care to elaborate a bit on your expectations? We have in France, of course, the presidential elections coming up, and then the whole question becomes, well, what lies beyond? Will a second Macron presidency sort of consolidate the first? Are there major changes to be expected? What's your take on the sort of longer view, if you will?
Thank you, Alexander. I mean, how long do I have? Because that's a lot of questions. So I'm going to try and be and then and then I'm sure there will be questions in the Q&A, and I can come back to some of the points. So I mean, it's nice really to talk about future cooperation, bearing in mind everything that's just been said about where we are. So, you know, the fact that there was going to be a period of mourning, the fact that Northern Ireland Protocol needs to be resolved, the fact that the tone isn't helping. I mean, I think to think about the future, it's quite important to understand where both sides are in terms of their own kind of foreign policy and defence thinking. And I think the UK published its integrated review, which is this blueprint for global Britain in action. And when you talk to British diplomats, they say, you know, this is very much it's a basis, it can evolve. It's true that, you know, it doesn't mention the EU. In fact, it mentions it once, I think on page 144, where it says the UK and the EU could work together in basically, I'm paraphrasing, but in areas of common interest. So tackling, you know, climate change, and biodiversity threats and all the rest of it. But that doesn't mean that the door is firmly closed on future cooperation with the UK and the EU. And I think actually I sort of at the time wrote a piece on what the integrated review meant for France. And I think it might have even sounded slightly disingenuous from the UK government to all of a sudden in its integrated review talk about the EU when there were, you know, we've just come out with quite a politicized and political point in the bilateral relationship, that obviously we needed to see how the TCA was going to work, some of the obstacles and issues around that. But I certainly think that, and maybe that is my optimistic point, and I will try and lift up towards the optimism side of the scale, because I do think that there is opportunities, but obviously that will depend on how talks in the Northern Ireland Protocol go. And as we said, those aren't straightforward. But, you know, I think there will be some conditions to that. And I think the UK, in terms of in its integrated review, again, talks about being firmly committed to guaranteeing European security, for example, doing more in NATO. It also talks about EU and NATO doing more together as well. But I think that when you're talking about defence capabilities, defence joint procurement, all the rest of it, I think the UK government will expect perhaps more access to the EU's defence market, which we know that's something that the United States has been pushing for over the years. And I think that will be closely watched, especially now that we have a US administration that has openly said that it would, you know, supports EU defence, supports a role for the EU in defence. And I think that will be closely monitored in London. So even if the door is not firmly closed, of course, there will always be conditions attached on both sides. But we know absolutely clearly that the UK government doesn't believe in an institutional form of relationship with the EU in terms of foreign policy. And one of the things that I often hear from British diplomats is it's all in the integrated review. You know, if you want to understand where British foreign policy is at, read the integrated review. And I sort of think, well, that's not good enough. People don't have time to read all the integrated review. And also that's where tone and, you know, concrete proposals matter. They need to match up. And I think for countries, you know, I mentioned France, but other countries in the EU that take an interest, obviously, in the UK, but the UK, for whom the UK isn't a priority, actually oftentimes when they think about the UK, they will base their assumptions on what the Prime Minister has said or some of the interventions that are made, or even newspaper articles, and not necessarily government papers. But I think actually looking at sort of, you know, the integrated review, but also the UK government published a number of other papers like the Defence Command paper, the Defence Industrial Strategy. You know, there are things in there that are really interesting. The UK government, you know, committed to an increase in defence spending right in the middle of a pandemic. These are all things that actually, you know, there was a real worry at some point in Europe that the UK would be moving away from Europe and pivoting towards the Indo-Pacific. And actually some of the commitments show that the UK remains a committed European security player. So when we're thinking about the future UK-EU relationship, obviously, you know, what the UK says and what it actually does will matter. But I think there are also questions in London about what the EU wants from its relationship in foreign policy and security policy with the UK. And we know that there'll be the global compass, perhaps that's something, the strategic compass, perhaps that's something that Timon can come back to in March, that should give an indication on what the EU has planned, what its priorities are going to be in external action, what its partnerships, you know, who it considers its partners. And thinking back to the speech that President von der Leyen gave, the State of Union speech a couple of months ago, I mean, that too, I think, ruffled some feathers in London, where some people said, well, the president seems to have mentioned everyone apart from the UK. And I think, again, if we are trying to think constructively, it's going to have to require greater clarity on both sides on what they want to do together, but also what they don't want to do together. I think that's also helpful. But the timing is an issue, waiting on a German government. France is about to enter a presidential election. And also, I think, you know, next year is going to be sort of the midterm point for President von der Leyen and Charles Michel. And I think there's a question there about the EU taking stock of what it's done and what it wants to do in the future. I think there are lots of ways the UK and the EU could cooperate on things like, you know, defence capabilities. My friend and colleague Sophia Besch from the Centre for European Reform wrote a really interesting paper on this. There are other things about what could they do in the space of technology, protecting resilience of critical infrastructure. But I think, and I'll stop here because I spoke about France before, I think the question that I'm really interested in, and I don't think gets enough attention, is what happens in NATO as well. Because what I can see right now is the United States, but possibly even the UK, pushing for China to be treated as a file inside inside NATO, whereas you have some NATO allies who are also EU member states who feel that there should be more of a China discussion between the EU and the US and the EU, potentially in the UK. And I think that division and that tension within NATO between those who are NATO allies and who are EU member states and the others will be something that we'll see again and again. So I think we need to monitor how those tensions go and whether those inevitably bleed in somehow to the UK-EU relationship. Anyway, I will stop there because I've talked for far too long, but can come back in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Georgina. That's a set of fascinating ideas to think about, because indeed, yeah, you can only decouple policy conversations so far from one another. Timon, would you care to elaborate from your point of view on the medium-term outlook? And then, of course, I'll also invite Jonathan and Fabian later on to add anything that springs to mind on their side.
Thank you, Alexander, and I'm happy you gave us the easy part of the discussion about the future outlook of EU-UK relations. But I must say I will be a bit conservative in what I can say, but I agree with Georgina that I think what is possible on the medium and long term will very much depend on what happens in the next days, weeks, and months. And at this point in time, personally, I'm not that optimistic, both for EU-UK relations in general or for Northern Ireland in particular, where we stand at this point in time. But I remain hopeful that we can go forward. Very briefly, to come back to Northern Ireland, the protocol is, of course, something that both sides signed up to, and it should be seen. I mean, it's quite remarkable that the EU has agreed to let a third country control the outer border of its internal market. So this is a solution that is meant to guarantee the rights of people in Northern Ireland and to protect the peace process there, and therefore it's not up for renegotiation, as I said before. But within the framework of the protocol, and after listening carefully to all stakeholders in Northern Ireland, I think the EU has gone to the outer limits to find solutions for the problems of people and businesses on the ground. And that is what the EU is discussing with the UK at this point in time. I mean, you should be aware that the EU is even ready to change part of its own legislation to find solutions for problems it never wished for. Now, if you ask me to look forward, I think we also have to look backwards, and we should not forget that Brexit and everything that followed from it was a decision by the UK. It was, of course, based on a national referendum, and I fully respect that decision. But personally, I deplore it, and I think the EU clearly never wanted it. I'm one of those Anglophiles who loves the UK, actually, who has always loved to work with UK diplomats when they were still part of the club, even if their positions weren't always easy to deal with. But what we see over the course of the negotiations with the UK that I've been following is that the EU was led by a couple of essential principles, which are important. Among those, the protection of the rights of its citizens and its internal market. Our internal market is a unique ecosystem which we need to protect. Making sure there is a balance of rights and obligations in any agreement that we have with the UK, taking into account also the agreements that we have with other third countries, to protect the decision-making autonomy of the EU, and very specifically the protection of the peace process in Northern Ireland. Now, looking towards the future, I think it's safe to say that the EU will continue to be guided by these principles, whatever happens in the next couple of days and weeks. Member states are very conscious and convinced of those principles, and they have worked as a unifying force between member states. So I said it before, I've witnessed an impressive display of unity throughout these negotiations between the member states, even at some of the most difficult junctures. And I genuinely believe that unity will continue to prevail even in a possible worst case scenario. So I'm personally not sure what to expect from the negotiations that are going on as we speak. But as I said before, we should do everything to find a solution, because a negative scenario would mean a lose-lose situation for all involved, which is the last thing we want. Well, and then arriving to the foreign and security policy field, which is of course my bread and butter at the EAS. In these areas, when you ask me to look at the future, I think at this point in time, I can only express hope. I think hope that there will be solutions found on the issues at hand, so we can look forward to a further normalization of our diplomatic relations. The EU head of delegation in London presented his credentials to the Queen on the 19th of October, after the EU and the UK agreed on an establishment agreement for the EU delegation in London, and that was an important momentum. But if you look at the state of the world in terms of geopolitics and geoeconomics, I mean, digitalization, the need for resilience, China's power projection, the Russian stance, I think you can say that there's a lot that we can do together as EU and UK, as we share many common values, interests, and concerns worldwide. And Georgina spoke of the UK integrated review. I think, and I agree with that, it attests to that fact, even if the EU is hardly mentioned in the document as an important partner for the UK. I also agree with Georgina on European security. I mean, the UK has clearly stated that that is important for them. And I do see a pivot to the Indo-Pacific tilt, but this pivot is also there from our side. And it's actually one of the areas where I think we can talk. So knowing what the UK wants and what the EU wants, I think to get clarity on that, I think the timing depends on the broader political atmospherics, but just on the global compass, that is of course something that is being discussed with the member states as we speak. So it's too early to go into that. But if you look at the integrated review, I mean, I think it's a question of presentation of global Britain as an independent player in the international arena after the UK left the EU. And I'm personally pretty sure that on the longer term, if the broader political context allows for it, that we will find common ground to work in many areas. I think of counterterrorism, sanctions, cybersecurity, the fight against disinformation, human rights, consular cooperation. We have our Indo-Pacific strategy. The UK has its Indo-Pacific tilt. We both want to work on connectivity as one of the answers to China's Road and Belts initiative. We both value EU-NATO cooperation and are working on a joint declaration. And we're sitting at the same table in many areas of multilateral fora like the UN, NATO, OSCE. There's the Intergovernmental, the G7, the G20, and of course now the COP26. Many of these areas are represented in the trade and cooperation agreements, and others are not, as the UK decided not to follow through with the position they took together with us in the joint political declaration under Prime Minister Theresa May. So I think we need some time. We need some time to clarify things and to get a good sense of what is possible and what is not. I'll stop there, Alexander. Many thanks.
Many thanks for elaborating on those points, Timon. It seems that the very bleak outlook that was prevalent at the beginning is lifting somewhat, but perhaps it will return. So, Fabian, I'm very curious to hear whether you have been cheered up modestly or not at all.
I'm not sure I have. I'm sorry to say, because I think that I agree with pretty much everything which has been said. The problem is, to put it very simply, that the logic for cooperation has always been strong, but that's not necessarily what is going to drive the outcome. And that remains the paradox that in the end, if we are looking at this problem from two different, if you like, political frameworks, from two different ways of looking at this. If London looks at this as essentially a zero-sum game where the outcome has to be a win on the UK side in terms of sovereignty, then we're not going to go anywhere. And I think this is the difficulty also with many of these other areas where, of course, the logic is extremely strong. I mean, I referred to in my talk already to climate change. We should have gone into COP26, in my view, with a much stronger EU, UK, US position, which had been coordinated upfront. Yes, there were talks, but it wasn't enough. And I think we could have had a better outcome. We will get a lesser outcome, in my view, from the negotiations at the moment, also because of some of these political frictions. That's unfortunate, but I think at this moment it's inevitable. There is a belief on the UK side that threats work. And I didn't expect that Timon would comment on the question of bad faith. But what we continuously have is diplomacy by op-ed, where we have very strong statements, very strong threats being made on a continuous basis. Now, if we are more optimistic, we believe that these are only threats because the UK believes that that's a way of moving the EU. If we are less optimistic, then these threats are real, and there's something which is going to follow from that. But in either case, it's not a good sign for the relationship, because a relationship has to be built on trust. You cannot work out these kind of issues if you don't have trust. So for me, unfortunately, and I said this already when we were having the TCA negotiations, but it's a question of bad, worse, or catastrophic. There's no really good outcome in near future. I think the best possible outcome is that the kind of conflict we're seeing now continues on a low level without escalating. But it's not a positive outcome in terms of having the deeper cooperation, the more global cooperation. And I think the question of Northern Ireland I don't see a solution at the moment, because in the end, what we had from the Johnson government in the TCA negotiations was repeatedly and very strongly this comment about, we are quite happy with a relationship which is like Canada, which is a very loose economic relationship. Now, if we had a different type of Brexit, even if we had some of the ideas which were put on the table by Theresa May, then you could bridge the situation in Northern Ireland from an economic perspective. But if you have a relationship where the UK very clearly is diverging and is intending to diverge, then you have a problem with Northern Ireland, because you cannot have both at the same time. And that, I think, is a fundamental issue. I saw there was a question also on the European Court of Justice. I don't think this is about the technical role of the European Court of Justice. This is about a principal rule about sovereignty, where the UK government wants to be able to also say in the domestic setting that the EU has no jurisdiction in Northern Ireland. Now, if that is the case, I find it very difficult to see how we can implement the current solution.
Thank you, Fabian, and thank you also for already addressing the question that was raised by Fernando Ramirez Gaston in the Q&A. I'll perhaps turn over the floor to Jonathan to respond. And Jonathan, please feel free to already integrate in your comments the response to the questions that have already been raised in the chat or in the Q&A. It's a bit confusing because there's a private Q&A that goes directly to the panelists, and there's the open chat. But in the meantime, let me also already invite the audience to pitch in with further thoughts, questions, and comments that then can be addressed after Jonathan has given his view on the future outlook.
I'll try to be quick and optimistic. First of all, we are in Egmont, which is a great Belgian institution, which leads me, having lived in this wonderful country for 43 years, longer than I've lived anywhere else, leads me to reflect on the Belgian contribution. First of all, this sort of issue is one that Belgians sort out over breakfast. Sometimes takes a few years, but apparently inextricable constitutional issues are bread and butter for this great kingdom and the reason why it still exists. On the other hand, let's not be romantic. Let's be hard-headed. COP26, there was no European position. There was no Belgian. There is, because it's still going on. There is no Belgian position. So let's not believe too readily that there is an absolutely unchangeable set of European positions, or indeed, of course, that there's an unchangeable set of British positions. The dust hasn't settled yet. Brexit has barely begun. We are all still in the COVID-19 crisis. And both the EU and the UK will change as a result of Brexit. Second point, the UK is a European country, tied historically, geographically, for better or for worse, to the fate of its continent, sharing most of the challenges, the opportunities too, but most of the challenges and dangers of its European partners. So in the medium term, which you've asked me to address, I am reasonably confident, perhaps after another political cycle of elections and appointments, that Europeans will find a way to sit down at tables, perhaps tables and fora yet to be invented, to talk about ways of addressing common problems together. That will have to include the UK, will have to include the Swiss, by the way, for that matter. And the European Union in the past has shown itself sufficiently flexible to accommodate European countries which are of the European continent, but are not, for various reasons, members of the European Union. Thirdly, and this was a specific question, Northern Ireland, this is a matter of British sovereignty. Yes, of course, it is a matter of British sovereignty, but Northern Ireland is different from the rest of the United Kingdom in two important respects. First of all, politically, it is very different. The British political parties are not present in Northern Irish politics. Northern Irish politics are in many relevant respects very different from those of the rest of the UK. And above all, it is the only territory of the United Kingdom where the United Kingdom, as a matter of law, as a matter of international treaty, has said that it is perfectly willing to contemplate Northern Ireland leaving the UK to unify with Ireland if that is what the majority of its population wants. So when Margaret Thatcher was MP for a district of London called Finchley, that Northern Ireland is as British as Finchley, well, it wasn't true when she said it. It's certainly not true today. Nobody thinks that Finchley can have a referendum and go off and join another country. We all believe, we all acknowledge that that is the case of Northern Ireland. So it is different. And again, as a matter of law and international commitment, the UK has accepted that Ireland, the Republic, the member state of the European Union, has a stake in the way in which Northern Ireland is governed. There are all Ireland institutions and bodies. So yes, it is, until further notice and without prejudice, very clearly part of the United Kingdom and governed from the United Kingdom, subject to the devolved administration in the devolution arrangements in Northern Ireland. And finally, two quick questions I will try to address. What's the role of the United States and what's the importance of the Court of Justice? The United States has a role and a stake in the peace arrangements in Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement. The UK was a very important participant and sponsor. We all know the importance of Irish ancestry in US politics and indeed in the current incumbent of the White House, Joe Biden himself. So the Americans will no doubt watch all of this carefully. I hope that this is something that the Europeans can sort out amongst themselves. We are not putting on a very good face to the rest of the world. I think of what is happening tragically at the border between Poland and Belarus at the moment. If we cannot sort out problems in our own backyard or in our own territory, I say we Europeans as a whole, we shouldn't need the Americans to help us out, but they will be watching very carefully. Finally, the Court of Justice. I mean, there are ways of dealing with some of the sensitivities of the Court of Justice issue. The famous, not very successful, by the way, but the famous attempt to solve the problems of Switzerland in that regard are available as a sort of precedent. You have an arbitration level with a final recourse to the Court of Justice, and everybody sort of assumes and hopes that it will very rarely, if ever, be needed. But if it is a matter of absolute sovereign dogma that there should be no Court of Justice jurisdiction over anything that happens in Northern Ireland, then you lead very quickly to the next phase, which is there should be no role for the EU's legal system in Northern Ireland, which means that the single market, which is simply a set of legal rules and mechanisms and procedures, shouldn't apply in Northern Ireland at all. And you tear up the protocol and you go back to square one and you have a square and a circle next to each other without any possible combination, which is where this all started and is simply untenable. So there has to be pragmatism, there has to be sensible compromise, because that is the only way Northern Ireland can be governed, the way Northern Ireland is governed in the most successful era of its existence, which is the current one, at which Northern Ireland has a fragile but nevertheless sustained peace.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I was absolutely delighted that you already picked up on the question that was raised by Mark Stevens about the role or potential role of the U.S. administration in all of this. And perhaps that's also something that the other panelists can respond to, whether the Biden administration as sort of an external party that is at least moderately trusted by all sides for all sorts of reasons. Whether the Biden administration can take on this sort of arbitration role, but also whether it's actually a good idea to rely on Washington for fulfilling that function or playing that part, so to speak. There are also other questions that are coming in over the chats. There's Juliette Renaud, who wonders how we envision a future defense EU-UK relationship, whether the European Union could conceivably extend an invitation to the UK to take part in EU defense initiatives. Perhaps that's something that Timon can shed some light on. And Frédéric Lamberty is also wondering, does France's rather combative attitude have the blessing of other EU member states, most affected by Brexit or otherwise? Perhaps that's something that Georgina would like to pick up on. But we're now in the open Q&A, so we can freewheel a bit as thoughts come to mind, so to speak. I see Fabian is raising a finger, so Fabian, over to you.
For others also to come in, but just to on the US, I think we shouldn't put too much hope in that changing outcomes, because the US has been very clear about where it stands on this, and it doesn't seem to have made a significant impact on the behavior on the UK side. Yes, I think there would be consequences, but we should also not forget that the US is engaged in very much a global geopolitical contest with China, which is swamping out everything else at this moment. So I wouldn't expect that the US will be the solution to what is happening in Northern Ireland, even though they will play a role. And arguably, without the intervention of the US, we might have been at a worse place already. So that's something also to bear in mind. On whether France's rather competitive attitude has the blessing of other EU member states, it's a question of whether it is a combative attitude. I think there are a number of things which France has already been warning about in terms of what it expects. But in any case, I think whether the action of France is fully shared by others or not, in the end it comes down to, in my view, a very practical political consideration that you're talking about your fellow member states, and not an unimportant one when it comes to France, versus a third country. And there is no question that your relationship with a fellow member state will always be vastly more important than the relationship with a third country. So in the end, when it comes to this relationship, and I think Timon already mentioned it, the unity of the EU will hold. I don't see any significant challenge to that coming from other countries. And arguably, what is happening in Germany at the moment might actually make things more difficult for London, because certainly Chancellor Merkel has always tried to be conciliatory, has tried to resolve some of the issues. I'm not sure from a political perspective that the new government is going to try to do that, and certainly some parts of the new government are rather close to Macron and to the French position. So I think that's something also to look out for in the next few weeks. And I just wanted to make a final comment, which just to maintain my relentless pessimism. But I think, yes, of course, we could envisage a different future. But the question is, how long is the medium term away? Are we talking about something which is more the long term? And as Kane said, in the long term, we're all dead. We have problems now which need to be resolved. But on a less general point, I think we should not underestimate the potential for this to continue to spiral out of control if we go down this route. That if we are having this level of conflictual relationship, then this will also spill over into all the other areas. You will, for example, have a very difficult relationship when it comes to fisheries, when it comes to a number of the issues. We already have seen, for example, when it comes to EU citizens in the UK, a number of problems appearing with their treatment being questionable. For example, in terms of having to provide proof of residence, which is very difficult to obtain. So, I mean, we are already in quite a difficult relationship. And if this continues to spiral downwards, it's very hard to see that at some point in time that turns around, not least because also the perception of what is happening is very different on both sides of the channel. I think if you read the UK press, most of the UK press, of course, they are exception, then the image you're getting of what is happening at the moment is very, very different from what is really happening. And if that continues, what we could see is more divergence, more distance, rather than a closer relationship in future. So unfortunately, while I think we should hope and work for the best, I think we also are back at the point when we have to seriously plan for what this relationship might mean if it is on a semi-permanent basis, confrontational, difficult in all of these different areas.
Thank you. Timo?
Thank you very much. A couple of points. I agree with Jonathan that both the EU and the UK will change as a result of Brexit. Unfortunately, yes, we will have to adapt, and we will adapt. And I think that the state of the European Union showed how the EU is looking ahead, and finding a new equilibrium within the EU and with the UK. This will take time. Clearly, we're at a critical juncture now, and I think the dust has to settle. Yes, I also agree that trust is crucial, and I would say to that, so let's build it. It takes two to tango, of course, and we continue to invite the UK. I'm not an expert on governance, but I do know that the ECJ is a fundamental aspect of the internal market and the legal system that we built. Jonathan explained it very well, and the UK knows this fully. On the US, we know, of course, that they are extremely concerned and that they are following the issue up from very, very close on both sides. I can say no more about that. On defense initiatives, so the UK is a third country now, and the EU has clear instruments for third parties to contribute to EU initiatives. We have PESCO, there is the possibility of a framework participation agreement for missions and to contribute to missions and operations. There's the EDA, on which you can have an administrative arrangement like we're discussing with the US. So there are possibilities. At this point in time, we do not sense a great interest from the UK side. So let's see where that goes. On France's combative attitudes, I cannot speak for other member states, of course, but what I do sense is that there's a lot of solidarity from other member states for France, both on AUKUS and both on the fisheries issue. And on AUKUS, I should stress that this, of course, is something that touches also upon wider EU interest, as it is a pact that has an impact on policy in a region in which we as EU and all the member states have a lot of concerns and a lot of interests ourselves. So it's unfortunate, of course, that it was not consulted or we were not informed upfront, but we are where we are and we have to look towards the future, and we look forward to avoiding these kind of misunderstandings. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Timon. Georgina, over to you.
Thank you. I'll be very quick because I'm conscious of time. I'll take the defence one first because perhaps that's the easiest one to answer. I mean, I think London has been very clear that it doesn't really like the terms and conditions for third countries' access to the EU's defence industrial programmes, and I think there's also a level of scepticism in London that the EU will ever become a defence actor. I mean, I'd almost go as far to say the US might be slightly more optimistic about the EU's defence capabilities than the UK, simply because the UK has been in the Council working groups, was a member for the EU for a very long time. But I agree that the UK outside of the EU there's loads that's happened since the 2016 vote. It's accelerated, I think, quite noticeably over the past year. And I think we'll have to see, but it's clear at the moment that London doesn't really like those terms, and that's why I suspect that London will try and pursue arms cooperation in other fora. So not negotiate with the EU and try and get but use those other multilateral forums that have existed for a very long time that aren't always very effective, but that do allow a conversation with the UK and actually usually individual EU countries on arms cooperation, bilateral deals and all the rest of it. And I think there's an important question there for the EU on how it responds to that. Is it supportive of member states, trying to strengthen bilateral defence capabilities with the UK or bilateral defence deals, or does it not like that? Is that a hindrance as it's trying to craft its own common EU defence position? I think there's a question there for the EU, and it's an important one. Finally, on France, I agree with everything that's been said. I don't really see the kind of France being isolated. If anything, it has the support of other member states. I just think that there is a very big risk with France and the UK, but I would venture to extend that to other member states, that everything that the other side does is seen through their own Brexit prism. So the UK sees everything that France does through its own Brexit prism and vice versa. And that means that even missteps are sometimes perceived as direct confrontations or intentional, when actually sometimes they're just missteps. That wasn't, France wasn't thinking about the UK and the UK wasn't thinking about France. And I think that's not helped with something that Fabian said, Twitter diplomacy. You said op-ed diplomacy, but I think it's a lot of the time Twitter diplomacy that's not very helpful. And it was not helped by COVID, meaning that face-to-face discussions weren't possible either. So I think there is a question there for the EU on whether the UK favours minilateralism, different types of groupings, talking about defence and foreign policy outside the scope of the EU. How does the EU react to that? And I think for the UK and the EU, how can they move beyond this constant everything the other side does through the Brexit prism? Because I don't think that's very constructive.
Thank you very much, Georgina. Perhaps also a good reminder that spending time on Twitter is not necessarily anything that amounts to actual diplomacy in real life, or should for that matter. Ladies and gentlemen, we have unfortunately already reached the end of the allotted time, so we will be gently wrapping up. I do want to pick up on one of the points that Sir Jonathan has made, namely that we are still, of course, struggling to overcome the pandemic environment in which we still find ourselves, and in that sense, that process has now been dragging on for already too long, much too long to the liking of many of us, presumably. But it, of course, also raises the idea that when the pandemic does water down to something something that is manageable indefinitely, or something that, in the best case, entirely disappears again, perhaps that will indeed also have the consequence of making some things easier again, just to visit each other's capitals again on a more significant scale, have more mobility and dialogue again. That will probably help, and that is something that we have been also feeling the impact of, I think, over the past 18 months, trying to keep everything afloat under very difficult circumstances. Having said that, I would like to thank all of you, both panelists and everyone in the audience, for making this webinar such a lively and thought-provoking debate. It was a pleasure on the side of Egmont to team up with colleagues from the European Policy Center. So also thanks, Fabian, for helping making this all possible. And also a big thank you to Jonathan, to Timon, and to Georgina for joining me here on this virtual panel. I've learned loads. Thanks so much for taking the time and sharing your insights with all of us. That will be it for today, but we do hope to welcome you again for one of our forthcoming events, either in person, in the flesh, in the Egmont Palace, or again in a virtual setting. We will continue to have a mix of both as time goes by in the coming months. So let me wish all of you a pleasant remainder of this Wednesday afternoon, a good bank holiday tomorrow for those of you based in Belgium or France, and looking forward to welcoming you again at a next occasion. Over and out.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All the best.